Hello, I'm Jeffrey Young, Senior Correspondent for the Voice of America in Washington. My guest today is Professor Mark Galeotti. He's at New York University. He's in our New York studio. Mr. Galeotti, thank you so much for joining us.
A pleasure.
You have recently run a piece, a written piece, an article that talks about crime in Ukraine. And there's so much turmoil in Ukraine to begin with militias, with secessionists, with people that are agitating with the trouble that's on the eastern part of the country, the loss of Crimea, and now we have the element of organized crime. I want to pull a line from a work that you have recently run in a publication called Vice, and the line that I wanted you to reflect upon first is this: now Ukraine is beginning to shape crime around the rest of the planet. Please explain that.
Well, what we have to realize is that just like legitimate economies are nowadays totally globalized, so too, frankly, the underworld is now a global phenomenon. And so gangsters are always looking for new opportunities, and new places are basically doing their work more safely and more cheaply than ever before. And what they're looking for is somewhere that hits a certain sweet spot that has, on the one hand, a corrupt local regime, and also a degree of chaos to create the sort of space for them to operate, but at the same time is thoroughly connected into the world systems of banking, of trade and commerce and so forth. And Ukraine hits that particular sweet spot, particularly the Crimean Peninsula that the Russians have now taken over. On the one hand, you have a local elite that has a long and undistinguished history of close links with organized crime, and a peninsula that is now linked in with the big Russian criminal combines. But at the same time, you have a banking system, you have large ports and so forth. And so we're already beginning to see Crimea emerging as a kind of a global meeting place for criminal businesses. We've seen everything from drugs from Africa being shipped through there. We're seeing the possibility of heroin from Afghanistan, because about a third of it goes through Russia, now being diverted to move through Crimea and so forth. And what this means is that it might just seem a local thing, but if it makes the drug flows and the other illicit flows safer and cheaper, then it begins to affect how other gangsters look at it. Colombians and other Latin American criminals thinking, well, we'll use Crimea to move cocaine into Europe and Asia, and we'll swap it for heroin that we then may well sell on the streets of the United States, for example. So it might seem like something that's happening a long way away, but in fact it can very quickly hit the streets of the rest of the world.
This is such an opportunity for crime to be able to set up a region like this where they can operate essentially with impunity, from what I understand. When we go back to earlier in 2014, and we saw the secession of Crimea from Ukraine, it begs the question, I have to ask the question, how involved were the organized crime elements in the secession move? Could they see in advance? Do you think that they saw in advance what an opportunity they had, and by pushing for secession, by helping to agitate for secession, that they were working to create this opportunity so that they would have this place, this grand bazaar for criminal activity, for transnational crime, for the transshipment of contraband?
Well, I wouldn't want to give them too much credit for forward thinking, but also I think we have to realize, as it were, the role that crime plays within Russia itself, because in a way we're talking about an offshoot of Russian gangsterism. Organized crime in Russia is very, very powerful, but nonetheless it appreciates one basic fact, that the biggest gang in town is the state. Under Vladimir Putin, the Russian government has made it clear that it's content to see organized crime operate to an extent. I mean, police will still try and do their jobs, but there's no serious and systematic crackdown. But only insofar as organized crime realizes its place, realizes that when the state makes sort of requirements upon them, they have to follow. So I think what happened in Crimea was essentially political. The real impulse came from the Kremlin, came from the government. But when they were starting to look for, okay, well, who are going to be useful proxies to have on the ground? One of the groups they turned to was local organized crime, and they very, very quickly appreciated, first of all, that it's always good policy to say yes to the Kremlin, because you'll get favors in return. But secondly, I think the massive potential economic opportunities of an autonomous Crimea within the Russian Federation. So they didn't start the process, but they were very quickly involved in the process and were certainly very enthusiastic about it. And quite a few of the sort of gunmen in the so-called, local self-defense militias and so forth, we know were actually thugs of local gangs, just given assault rifles and armbands and told to go out and loom menacingly. That's where a lot of the sort of the street muscle for the secession movement came from.
And let's also look at the eastern part of Ukraine, Luhansk, Donetsk, these areas. We have so-called militias that have fought against the Ukrainian government. It's pretty obvious that there is direct Russian assistance here. And once again, we go back to the organized crime question. We have the political side of it, and we have the organized crime side of it. Who is in charge in terms of organized crime in these two areas now, the so-called Novorossiya in Luhansk and Donetsk? Is it the Russian crime syndicates? Have they overwhelmed the local Ukrainian bad guys? Or just exactly where does this lie at this point?
Well, I'm afraid I'm going to have to live down to every expectation of the woolly-minded academic and give you a sort of, it depends what you mean kind of answer. No one person or one group is in charge. The thing is, Russian organized crime, one of the things that makes it so effective and so powerful is that it's basically a network. Instead of, we think of, the 5 families of the mafia in New York, for example. It's been definitely hierarchical. There is a godfather, there are then sort of captains beneath them, all the way down to the foot soldiers at the bottom. That's not the way that the Russian gangs tend to operate. They tend to be much flatter networks of people who are cooperating for mutual advantage, some of whom are more powerful and richer, but that doesn't mean to say that they're gang bosses, except on a very local level. So what we've seen in eastern Ukraine, this so-called Novorossiya region, is rather stronger and stronger alliances being built. If you're a local gangster in Donetsk, it's not as if you're thinking that the slang is the Varyagi, the Varangians. It's the sort of slang for the gangs from Moscow. It's not that you think the Varyagi are going to come and take over your street-level operations. That's not what they're interested in. They're coming to make a deal. They're coming to say, join our network. You have to kick back a certain amount of profit to us, but on the other hand, you'll now have access to much, much greater opportunities. So really what we're seeing instead is local organized crime is getting integrated into Russian criminal networks, which of course is going to be a real problem if Kiev ever manages to reconquer these areas. But what that also means is that there is no one person in charge. You have lots and lots of local big men, many of whom actually are not what we might think of as the sort of tattooed thugs that we see on the streets, but they are local political leaders, they're local businessmen who have a portfolio of interests ranging from the seemingly legitimate to the totally criminal. And it's this corrupted and criminalized local elite that I think are the key actors. Moscow obviously is protecting them and sheltering them, but when it comes down to it, these are people who are out for their own interests rather than anything else. So the interesting thing is actually, unfortunately, no one really is in charge of Novorossiya. We have lots and lots of local warlords and strongmen who at the moment are choosing to work together, but they all have their own interests and agendas.
So in one small region, Novorossiya, we have a paramilitary element, we have a political element, we have a criminal element, but nobody in charge.
That's right. I mean, there is notionally a newly elected prime minister and so forth, but the authority that these people have is only the authority that they can persuade the local warlords and local strongmen to give them. Every now and then, Russia decides to sort of make a show of force. There was one point when they sent in a unit that was recruited by Russian military intelligence called the Vostok Battalion that rolled into Donetsk and took the local militia headquarters and such like. But the point is, first of all, it's difficult for Russia to actually assert, or the Kremlin, to assert control over this region. And secondly, when it comes down to it, it's questionable whether the Kremlin really wants to. The point of Novorossiya is not to build a new state. It's actually to create chaos that will put pressure on Kiev to bend the knee. So from their point of view, a bunch of local warlords and strongmen are just as good as loyal Kremlin allies. They're still a thorn in Kiev's side.
We had a fully established criminal hierarchy under Viktor Yanukovych. Viktor Yanukovych gets driven from power at the end of February 2014. He's gone. And then what about all of this infrastructure, the organized crime infrastructure in Ukraine under Yanukovych, what happened to them? Have they realigned themselves? Are they still there? What's their status now that their protector and benefactor is gone, and obviously a new regime is there? And does the new regime have any contact with them at all, or are they just the guys on the out? How would you characterize this situation? It seems a bit difficult.
It is, and really what it reflects is the tragedy that, in fact, what we're seeing at the moment playing out in Ukraine is the result of more than 20 years of, frankly, failure to create a proper working state. Yanukovych was just the most recent of many presidents who had presided over institutionalized corruption. I mean, Ukraine, sadly, according to most international estimates, is more corrupt than Russia. Now, okay, the new regime hopes to do something about it, but the trouble is, what this means is that outside of Novorossiya, where clearly the local gangs have aligned themselves with the rebel movement, but elsewhere, the gangs align themselves with the former regime, not because out of any affection, but simply because that was advantageous to them. Now they're adapting to the new political environment. And the dilemma for Kiev is this. You're already fighting a military war in eastern Ukraine. Do you really also want to be fighting, can you also fight a political and law enforcement war in the rest of the country? They often, unfortunately, need to have to work with these corrupted local elites who are now professing their loyalty to the new regime, who are now saying that they're always in favor and that they'd love to see Ukraine look more towards Europe than Russia and so forth. They know what to say. But basically what they're interested in is maintaining their cozy little schemes and scams on their own turfs. And I think in the long term, it's clear that the Ukrainian government will have to do something about this. But at the moment, it doesn't seem to be a priority. So we see organized crime alive and well in the rest of Ukraine. And in some cases, actually still developing new deals with the Russian gangs. Because if you're really looking for, what are the big money spinners at the moment, it's being involved in things like moving Afghan heroin into Western Europe, where the real money is to be made. And to do that, you need to be working with the Russians. So at a time when Ukraine and Russia are, even if no one really admits it, pretty much at war, the Ukrainian and the Russian underworld are still very happily making money together.
Let me get your reflection on something that has come up in discussions that I've had about this, and I wanted to see your perspective on this. Organized crime is an effective tool of state policy for one country to use against another. By introducing strong criminal elements and activity into a country, the aggressor country can destabilize, can reduce the respect and the confidence that the people in the recipient country have for their government, for their leadership, for lawful authority, etc. It's a way of rotting it out from the inside. If you put a lot of crime in a country, then the country will seem out of control. And if it's out of control, then people have no confidence in the leadership, etc. So I want to bring this back to Russia and to Putin. Do you believe that Vladimir Putin, as the Russian leader, is deliberately using crime as a means of destabilizing Ukraine and possibly other states?
Well, there's two separate issues there. One is about how far states can use organized crime to rot out other states. And the second one is specifically about the Kremlin's policy. So let's deal with the first one.
Right.
Initially. It's actually very difficult to create organized crime. It's local conditions, market conditions, social and political conditions that create organized crime. It bubbles up to fill vacuums in states and systems that aren't really working adequately. And that's one reason, because no system is perfect. That's why organized crime you'll find everywhere in the world. What other countries can do is essentially either use those gangsters or facilitate it. For example, by refusing to cooperate in cross-border law enforcement work and that kind of thing. Now, if we look at what's going on with the Kremlin, though, it's really interesting because I think it represents a whole new form of the relationship between the state and crime. Governments often cut deals with gangsters. Sometimes it's because they seem to be the least worst option. Maybe, for example, you're happy to enlist gangsters to keep an eye out for terrorists, for example, because you're more worried about terrorists. We saw that even, for example, the United States cut deals with the Sicilian mafia during World War II to ease the way in which sort of Allied forces were able to invade Italy. So sometimes sort of state purposes require that. But it tends to be a very short-term and very instrumental and very specific form. There's no real sense of an alliance. It's just, we don't like you, but we need to cut a deal with you. And the other way we see a connection is often what happens is corrupted elements of the state get involved in organized crime. Whether it's the Iranian Revolutionary Guard that basically are involved in a massive level of drug smuggling, or whether it's just corrupt local bosses taking money for turning a blind eye to what's going on. The Kremlin, though, clearly has, for years, and especially under Putin, but it also dates back before him, for years been building up what we could think of as institutional alliances. We've seen, for example, organized crime being used to facilitate the work of Russian intelligence and espionage agencies. And conversely, the first indications that actually, as part of the deal, Russian spying agencies will provide information for organized crime. I mean, there's one very specific case in Canada. Sub-Lieutenant Jeffrey Delisle, a Canadian intelligence officer who became a mole for GRU, which is Russian military intelligence. Well, one of the types of information he was collecting was what the Royal Canadian Mounted Police knew about various Russian gangsters. It's very hard to think of any real statecraft reason why Russia would want that. It was almost certainly just to provide information to its friends and allies within organized crime. So a long-term use of gangsters as ways of facilitating intelligence gathering and espionage operations. Secondly, though, we now see in Ukraine an increased willingness to use criminals not just as street muscle for hire, but actually as part of your agency of rule. I mean, if you look at the guy who's in charge of Crimea now, Aksyonov, although he denies it, the only time he tried to take his denial to court, he lost. Because there are umpteen reports to suggest that he was, in fact, in the late 1990s, a fairly senior, middle-ranking figure within one of the two big organized crime syndicates that basically dominated Crimea, Salem. And that he maintains his connections with organized crime today. So probably one of the reasons why Aksyonov was so useful for the Russians as their local proxy to put in charge is because he brought not just the criminal local elite with him, but also the underworld with him. And this is what we're seeing, a fusing of governance, international statecraft, and Kremlin policy. Still, the Kremlin is in charge. When the Kremlin says do something, you do something. But you do it not because out of loyalty, but because you know that the Kremlin is going to pay you back with favors, with impunity in the long term. And this is a process that's been going on for a long time and is going to be very, very difficult to break.
Focusing specifically on Vladimir Putin now, how well connected do you think he is to senior organized crime hierarchy elements, to people who are essentially criminal oligarchs? How connected is he?
He personally is not. If you look back to his time when he was in the local sort of mayor's office in St. Petersburg in the 1990s, there is pretty convincing evidence that he directly or through his agents, had relationships with local gangsters who, were very powerful in St. Petersburg. But the point is, as he has moved up the political hierarchy, his opportunities, but also his need directly to talk to these people has diminished, and frankly, it becomes much, much less important. I mean, Putin actually talks and has personal contacts with very, very few people these days. He's narrowed dramatically the ring of people to whom he actually talks to. So instead, it's Putin's people talk to people who somewhere in this chain clearly interact with key figures within organized crime. So he presides over a system, but I don't think he actually manages it. I think he's at the point where he says what he wants done, and it's the job of others to interpret how to get that done and who they need to deal with. But what is absolutely clear is that Putin has at no point instituted the kind of systematic campaign against organized crime that he promised when he was very, very first campaigning for election in 1999-2000, and which at the time a lot of gangsters were really worried about. They thought this man might actually mean what he was saying. He hasn't. Instead, a very explicit word went out to the organized crime world. said, look, you're still free to rob and enrich yourself, but appreciate the new rules of the game. You can't do anything that embarrasses the state. You can't do anything that works against the state. So no more drive-by shootings, for example, which make the state look as if it can't control the streets. We still have almost the same number of contract killings today as we did in the 1990s, which are always regarded as a sort of the wild years. But the point is that now it's focused and specific. So what's happened is basically Putin set the rules and organised crime realised that they had to follow it. Sometimes you have gangsters and gangs that break the rules, that go beyond what the state allows, and the state crushes them very, very effectively, very, very quickly. But Putin himself has, although he is not directly connected with these people anymore, he presides over a system which is clearly not just very permissive of organised crime, but actually depends on organised crime as part of its mechanisms for controlling the country.
If you were to advise Petro Poroshenko, the new leader of Ukraine, if you were put in the position of being his advisor on fighting crime, on fighting organized crime, on strengthening the legal structure and the police and investigative structures of Ukraine, what sort of advice would you give Mr. Poroshenko as far as trying to beef up Ukraine and make it more resilient, make it stronger, more robust, make it more capable of addressing the criminal elements within the country?
As close as you can find to a silver bullet is dealing with corruption. As I say, you're going to have organised crime in every society, in every country. But the point is, if you have endemic corruption within the state apparatus, as unfortunately you do find in Ukraine, then it doesn't matter what else you do. It doesn't matter how big you make the police force, because cases will get thrown out in court. It doesn't matter how well you reform the courts, because the police aren't going to arrest the people they really need to arrest. And so it goes. So I think, although it would be nice to think of something that will be able to deal with organised crime quickly and effectively, it's going to have to be a longer-term process, and it's going to have to start with the state apparatus. You deal with corruption at the national and local levels. You deal with corruption in the courts. You deal with corruption in the police force. Once you've done that, then you can begin to unleash the police and expand the police and develop the courts and do all these other kinds of things. Then you can really begin to actually take on organised crime. But until you've dealt with corruption, nothing else is going to frankly make any kind of a difference. And if, obviously, sort of once he's dealt with the crisis that's going on in eastern Ukraine, if Poroshenko wants to really make a difference to his country, really wants to leave a productive legacy, it's to deal with the level of systematic corruption, which frankly has thrived since Soviet times, and successive presidents have either failed or flatly not wanted to do anything about. Now, Poroshenko, I mean, he's personally obscenely rich, by my standards. He doesn't need the money. He actually is one of the few people who actually can step out of that system and lead from the top in dealing with that kind of corruption.
But obviously, some people, Prime Minister Yatsenyuk has made it clear that he wants stronger efforts against corruption. There are voices that I'm hearing in Ukraine. Transparency International in Kiev and other good governance groups have been demonstrating. They've been publishing incredible stuff day after day, week after week. There seems to be an upswelling in Ukraine to take action, for the state to do something to address this situation.
And this is why it's such an important historical moment. Because, to be honest, until relatively recently, really until the fall of the old regime, or the whole protest that led up to the fall of the whole regime, if you asked Ukrainians about what they thought about corruption, of course they thought it was a bad thing. But to be honest, they regarded it almost as like the weather. It could be bad, but what can you do about it? You just have to survive and weather it. Now I think people, for a very brief period, are actually thinking, no, maybe we can do something about that. There is a degree of optimism and enthusiasm. Now, that could easily be dissipated. And the problem is, of course, what's going on in eastern Ukraine is a massive distraction from state building in the rest of the country. It's very hard to think about institutional change when you're actually fighting rebels over a sort of swath of your own eastern regions. But nonetheless, this does represent an historical moment. And that combination of change of government at the top, public enthusiasm at the bottom, really does provide an opportunity to do something about corruption. And that's really what I'm hoping is going to happen.
What can outside entities, the international community, what can others outside of Ukraine do to help reinforce this effort to build stronger laws, to fight corruption, to strengthen the judicial structure, the legal structure, the law enforcement structure? What can the outside do to help Ukraine at this point?
Really, there are three things that the outside world can do. The first is the usual one in terms of providing assistance, which is, sometimes it means aid, because it's in our interests too, actually. But more often than not, it's actually about advice and information and best practice and so forth. And we have a wealth of experiences as to how you actually can deal with corruption. We have organizations ranging from NGOs to government to intergovernment agencies that can help. So that is available, and that needs to be done. Now, the problem in the past is that you can provide all the advice and assistance you want if the government itself isn't really seriously interested in doing that. I mean, I know from my experience, I've been involved in various sort of aid outreach efforts where you're just playing the game. You're telling them sort of what they need to do, and they pretend to believe you, and you know full well that they're not planning on doing anything. So in order to make sure that actually Ukraine really does follow through, as well as the assistance, you need to have, I think, a certain degree of tough love. There needs to be pressure on Ukraine. The temptation at the moment is, because Ukraine is stuck in this conflict with Russia, is to basically feel that you actually need to coddle Kiev. And I think that does no one any good at all. By all means, do so in a productive and helpful way. But if and when we do see Kiev backsliding, if we see them failing to meet their obligations, if we see, for example, clear cases of politically rigged trials, people being go free because they presumably bribed someone or whatever, then the outside world needs to actually hold Kiev to account for that. So it's that carrot and stick. The third element, though, is, as I mentioned, that, to be honest, while Kiev is fighting a war, a civil war and a foreign war, in its eastern provinces, it's very difficult for it to have the political will, the time, the effort to deal with corruption and organised crime at home. So in some ways, actually the first step is for the rest of the world to step up its efforts to push Russia to, if not the negotiating table, just simply to withdraw and abandon its support for this frankly illegitimate revolution in the East. By doing that, by ending this particular distraction, it will allow Kiev to really get down to dealing with crime and corruption. So those are the three key things that the West can do.
Dr. Galeotti, thank you very much. Dr. Mark Galeotti from New York University. He's been in our New York studio. I'm Jeffrey Young, VOA News, Washington.